Hi, good evening. Welcome to the sixth Heginbotham Literary Lecture. It's quite an opportunity. And this lecture series, we do it about every 2 years, and it's in honor of Professor Emerita Eleanor Heginbotham, over there. Thank you. And we've had some great writers come here to Concordia. Let's see if I can remember. We've had Patricia Hampel, David Troyer, Sandra Benitez, Garrison Keeler, and Louise Erdrich. So we've had some heavy hitters here. And so this year we're very lucky to have a writer who also did the book of the year here at Concordia, Peace Like a River. And so a lot of our students are reading this book, and so we've had some great discussions. The author was nice enough to come and talk with 2 groups of students today. And then we'll be here afterwards. We're going to have a little reception out in the lobby here, and he'll do a signing if anyone wants their book signed and some discussion and such. So our author today came down from northern Minnesota just for this, and he's going to drive all the way back up there tonight. Can you believe it? Worked for almost 20 years at Minnesota Public Radio, and I always thought it was from St. Paul here, and the name is very familiar to many people because of Minnesota Public Radio, but he was always up north and then down in southern Minnesota for a little bit too. And so he's now able to be up north and write full-time, which as a writer myself, I'm very envious of that. He told the students today that one of his inspirations, how he gets his ideas for writing is he goes out and flies a kite, literally. So I thought that was very impressive. So please give a big Concordia welcome to Leif Enger.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Eric. It's really... It's kind of enormous to me to be here for this. There's nothing quite like having your book in a school that you admire, being read by students. It's a humbling experience. I got to start by thanking Concordia for selecting Peace Like a River as the book of the year. Out of so many good ones, I don't really know how these decisions are reached, but however it is, I thank you. It means a lot to me. After being published, I think it's the next dream of every writer to somewhere, someday, somehow, be mandatory. So now that's a box I can check. And a special thanks to Eric and also to Nan Hackett for working so hard to be in touch with me and make this whole thing happen. I know that I'm not the easiest guy to get in touch with or to stay in touch with. I'm terrible about answering emails. Thanks very much. It's been worth it for me. I did have a lot of fun putting these notes together because aside from doing a lot of writing this year, I had a chance to do a lot of reading as well, more than usual. And it's reading I really want to talk about, reading, the magic that turns a book into a tornado, into something that catches you up, whirls you around, and readjusts the way you think about the world. This is the year that I decided to read instead of sleeping, which wasn't as bad as you think. I'll say more about that in a minute. In any case, reading, and I'm just going to go ahead and specify intentional reading, dedicated reading, the reading of books for pleasure, is worth our time and worth defending. Since the rise of the social media, there have been hordes of writers, teachers, librarians, booksellers, philanthropists, policy wonks, people I admire, people with really big footprints who have been out there talking and writing and posting on Facebook about this business, about illiteracy and distraction and the failure of schools, the filling of prisons, the defense of reading battalion, is out in full force and has never been busier. And I think this is exactly as it should be. I did just enough Googling to be temporarily overwhelmed by studies showing declines in student literacy, declines in reading among the young and among the old, links between illiteracy and poverty, bad health, drug habits, and everything else. I'm not going to list any of the studies tonight or quote from them, because if there's one thing worse than being bored to death, it's being bored to death by terrible news that is also redundant. I'm also not here to make light of the problem. It doesn't feel so much to me like a decline as like just one more part of this cultural acceleration that I think all of us notice. It feels not so much like a decline as like physics, like a centrifugal force. If the world spins faster, then it makes sense that certain quiet and lovely and reflective activities like reading a book in the evening, those things tend to fall off the couch and slide into the corners. I like Instagram as much as the next guy, and yet I don't know how a person avoids anymore the sense that we're somehow outracing ourselves, that we're being lapped by information and big data, rising oceans, genius microbes, drone warfare, surveillance in the marketplace, and constant, never-ending politics. I live 2 hours north of here on a dead-end road on a 56-acre farm. I literally cannot see the smoke from my neighbor's chimney, and even out there on the edge, it seems like things are always just picking up steam. And you think if the loudest voices, if the most insistent voices would take 30 minutes once a week and read some Winnie the Pooh, I think the world would cool off about 7 degrees. So if there's a defensive reading battalion, then sign me up. I want everyone to read. I want everyone to love reading. And it's the love part that is, of course, difficult to enforce. A few years ago, I was talking with a bookseller in San Francisco, and he said, "Did you ever read a book called How to Read a Book?" And I had not, never heard of it. In fact, I kind of wondered, why are you telling me this? Am I doing it wrong? But it was a busy day, and I was traveling, and I forgot all about it. And then last summer, that title sort of swam up into my mind. And I thought it was an intriguing title, and I hunted up a copy, old book. First edition of it came out, I think, in the 40s. How to Read a Book by Mortimer J Adler, who was a prominent teacher and a philosopher and writer and controversialist, Mortimer J. If this was a few decades ago, I think everybody here would probably know who he was. I think he was kind of impressive. Has anybody heard the name Mortimer Adler? Yeah, quite a few. So I got the book and I skimmed it, which I suppose is not how to read a book. And it was fascinating because it sounded so familiar in some ways, very familiar. And then I realized it sounded familiar because Mortimer Adler was part of the defensive reading battalion 70 years ago, when they also needed it, a post-war country then, looking upward. The impediments to reading then were different than they are now. Society was different. Books themselves tended to be hardcovers. The cheap paperback had been invented, but wasn't quite the magnificent thing it would become in the 60s and 70s. Adler was a professor at Chicago School of Law, and along with a mentor of his, he had developed a curriculum of classic works they felt were necessary for a sort of common baseline cultural literacy. There was a big self-improvement vibe in the country at that time, and I am just old enough, barely, to remember the residuals. We had a lot of battered hardcovers in our house by writers like Horatio Alger and G.A. Henty, books always about penniless boys, and always boys who, by dint of hard work and by dint of ambition and by dint of strong character and by dint also of amazing plot maneuvers, the boy always grows up and comes out running the company. Usually the boy was admired in these stories by two different girls, one who said little and smiled quietly and retired early, and one who talked all the time and stayed up late and had eyes that were really close together. God help the boy who chose wrong, although in these stories the boy never did. We also had in our house a shelf of books that I was not allowed to touch. I couldn't horse around with these. They were part of a set. They all had the same imprint and similar covers. They had plain lettering and a colored stripe at the top, as I recall. Later, I recognized this was to keep the editions inexpensive. But when I was 8 or 9, I just thought it was dull. No Hawkeye or Uncas on these covers. So I was not tempted by them anyway. These dull books belonged to my mom, and my mom belonged to a reading group called Great Books. And once a month or so, she would disappear and meet with a bunch of ladies, and they would talk about James Joyce or Plato or Ernest Hemingway or whoever the book of the month was. And Mom adored Great Books. She loved the books. She loved the people who read the books. She loved going to the group and drinking coffee and having intellectually stimulating conversation. And I think that there were hundreds, probably thousands of these Great Books groups all over the country. My parents were both teachers, and what I remember is a comforting feeling that as Americans, we ought to be up to speed on things. People wanted to know they were doing it right. If there was a set of books laying out a foundation of civilized thought and important works of fiction, then a certain number of Americans in the mid-20th century wanted to read those books. So Great Books, and specifically the Great Books Foundation, was a gigantically successful endeavor. Something like 1 million sets of these books were sold in the 50s and 60s. Not 1 million books, 1 million sets of books. So if even 15 or 20% of them got read and discussed, it was a big step forward for literacy. Bootstrap education, I think, at its best. And guess who started Great Books? It was Mortimer J Adler. Am I the only one who didn't already know this? Maybe I am. I had no idea until I read How to Read a Book. So the thing that really sticks out to me about Mortimer is the way that his defense of reading was suited to his times, by which I mean his defense of reading was deeply useful. It was very utilitarian. It was intended for people who wanted to improve themselves and who took that mission seriously. So in his very early pages of How to Read a Book, and I'm just going to boil this down, he lays out his treatise that there are 3 kinds of reading. First, there's reading for information, because you've got to have your facts right. Second, there's reading for understanding, so that you can properly synthesize and make use of those facts. Information, understanding, twin pillars of any civilized society. I don't have any problem going along with that. And then, as an afterthought, Mortimer writes, of course, there is still another goal of reading besides gaining information and understanding, and that is entertainment. However, this book will not be much concerned with reading for entertainment. It is the least demanding kind of reading, and it requires the least amount of effort. Furthermore, there are no rules for it. Everyone who knows how to read at all can read for entertainment if he wants to. Emphasis added. Now that feels kind of unkind to me. I can't help but picture old Mortimer writing that bit, kind of sitting in his study, kind of pursing his lips. There ought to be some rules for this. And that's where the generations kind of divide for me. Because I've read now thousands of books. I've read 1,000 books because I had to read them for coursework or for private study or for some sort of self-improvement. And I've read thousands more for entertainment, just because stories and characters and settings and sentences are things I love to spend time with. I'm now just about 54 years old, and I think I can say honestly that the stuff I read for information is gone. The stuff I read for understanding, mostly gone. But everything I loved is still in there. The best way I know how to talk about this is by relating a little bit about my longtime relationship with Moby Dick, which is one of those rare books that is on every list of the all-time greats, secure in the Pantheon. One of those books it doesn't even matter if you've read it or not because you know what it's about. Moby Dick to me was always that cranky old uncle that you met 3 or 4 times in your life. He lived 4 states away, he never came for Christmas. Now and then he'd show up at a wedding or a family reunion. Weird old gaunt Uncle Moby, looking over his shoulder all the time. Now, according to your dad, Moby, as a young man, used to do all kinds of magic tricks. With his hands, he'd pull things out of the air. And you always hoped he would show up and do some of his magic tricks, but he never did. Enough years go by, and you no longer expect anything out of Uncle Moby. Now, here I have to admit that my introduction to most of the books that we refer to as classics came via those old comic books, Classics Illustrated comic books. You remember these? They were probably one of the biggest reasons I wanted to be an English major in the first place. When you're 7, you don't realize the artwork is terrible and the color printing is a failure. You just know it's a great story. We had a stack of these comics, and we read them over and over. And sometimes we'd send in an order form and 25 cents and get a new one in the mail. My brother Lynn is older than me, so it was always his 25 cents. But he would take my opinion into consideration. We got Jekyll and Hyde, which was so scary my mom had to put it in a closet she didn't know I could reach. We got some Dickens, which were even scarier on account of all the beatings. We got Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and so forth. Last of the Mohicans, still my favorite of all time. But the one we never ordered, Lynn and I, we never ordered Moby Dick, and I'm not sure to this day why it is. I don't know what could be more appealing to an 8-year-old boy than a wild sea captain chasing a monster whale around the world. That sounds fantastic. Why did I not want it at the time? But I think what happened is that just through osmosis, Lynn and I both had the idea that this was a very big, very important, very intimidating story. More than we could handle, more than we could take. Nobody ever actually asked me to read Moby Dick until I went to college. And I was taking the American Survey course as an English major. Now, English professors have always been some of my favorite people. Men of whimsy and women of the written word. My novelist brother is an English professor over at Morehead State. One of my favorite uncles was an English professor who at 90 years old would just erupt in a roar and you'd realize he was quoting from Beowulf in the original Old English. Most of my English profs were oddball delights. They would, there was a brilliant old bachelor who wore his glasses at this strange angle, like this. And he would teach night classes with glasses of mulled cider for everyone and cookies he had baked. There was a woman 5 feet tall who used to arrive at her office by bicycle in the deeps of January, and she'd walk in talking as she walked through the door about madmen and wizards and poets scraping their verse into the stone walls of their prison cells. A little tiny woman. We would have died for her. There was a Chinese English prof with electric diction who described his final exams as heinous and impenetrable. There was an ancient poet of cigarettes and cowboy boots who published his verse to huge acclaim and then walked around campus silently daring people to look at him. I thought they were gods. But this American survey prof was the other kind. I mean, he absolutely knew his stuff. He was good at putting very dry old novels into historical context. But there was no lightning. Just an old man in a tan jacket, flat voice, long rectangular face like an open grave. Never got out of his chair, never turned his head. Top of the hour, he would take a deep breath, and then he'd speak at a low hum without pause or inflection for 45 minutes like a tire losing its air. And now that I'm older, I realize, man, the guy was probably in terrible health. He was probably exhausted. He probably was terribly burdened by personal tragedy, but I was 19. I was at my own personal apex of selfishness and vanity. I wanted magic and fire and blood. C.S. Lewis used to describe a certain type of writing as red meat and strong beer, and that is what I wanted. And the truth is, we read great stuff in this class. Hawthorne and Irving and Poe and a bunch of others. The material always overcame the deficit of the delivery. But we all had the syllabus, and we knew what was coming. Moby was coming. Moby was the last book of survey that semester. At the same time, I mean simultaneously, I had 3,000 pages of Dickens to read in a different class. And the thing is, by now, I loved Dickens, which was another big surprise after those comic books. Dickens turned out to be really funny. He turned out to be entertaining. I loved Dickens by this point. So it came to pass that in the last 10 days of that semester, I was faced with a choice. I could read Moby Dick and write an exam on it, and maybe shortchange Dickens a little bit, or I could shortchange Moby and give Dickens the attention I knew he deserved. So I made a decision. I made an executive D. I went to the bookstore and bought the first and only Cliff Notes of my life for Moby Dick. Guilt is a great clarifier of memory. So this is like yesterday. The college bookstore, the smell of cheap sweatshirt fabric. I remember looking sideways at the rack of Cliff's Notes. They're on one of those circular wire racks you can spin around. You know, I wanted to just stride in there boldly in daylight and buy the Cliff's Notes without shame. But I'm Norwegian. I can't do anything without shame. So I'm in there with my collar turned up, not looking anybody in the eye, like a kid trying to score a bag of weed. And after that, the shame just followed me. It followed me right through the final, which I aced, because the Cliff's Notes were fantastic. Those things should be illegal. It stayed with me through graduation and getting my first job as a very redundant newsman at KDMA Farm Radio in southwest Minnesota. It followed me into my next job working for NPR, and finally, at the age of 36, 2 kids right in the middle of the whole parade, I said to my wife, Robin, you know, I still feel kind of guilty about not reading Moby Dick. Guess what she gave me for my 37th birthday? And I was ambivalent about this gift. Not ungrateful. I was glad to have it. It meant she cared what I thought. She had listened to my little self-indulgent whine. It also meant she was calling me out. You feel guilty about Moby Dick? Here's your Moby Dick. Knock yourself out. So I tried it. I gave it a shot. It's got that great first line, "Call me Ishmael." And actually, the first few chapters were a really nice surprise because Ishmael turns out to be kind of a shockingly modern presence. Young guy at loose ends, doesn't fit in. He's got a pretty good sense of humor about it. Jokes at his own expense. He says, "Man, when the world starts to spin too fast, I got to get on a boat and go to sea." Well, he had me there. So off he goes to Nantucket because it's 1840, and Nantucket's where the action is if you want to get on a boat and go chase some whales. First thing that happens in Nantucket, Ishmael meets Queequeg, the pagan savage, the tattooed cannibal, and he doesn't just meet him. He shares a room with him at the boarding house. And not just that, he shares a bed with him because it's 1840 and that's how it's done. Personal space is an embryonic concept. It's not even a phrase yet, let alone an argument for a little privacy. So here's Ishmael, and he's sleeping with Queequeg, a cannibal from the South Pacific who is also looking for a ship, and who in the meantime is making ends meet by selling off his shrunken head collection. Heads from the good old days, heads of guys he killed and ate. And reading this, I thought, hang on. If I'd have known about the shrunken heads, I'd have read this when I was 12. So Ishmael and Queeg are hanging out in Nantucket, looking for work on a whale boat, and Sunday comes and Ishmael takes himself off to church. And here too, it had me at first, it did, because the minister is this old sailor who climbs up a rope ladder into a pulpit which is mounted way up near the rafters, so you have to crane upward to see him. And up the ladder he goes, and then, and this, I love this touch, he pulls the rope ladder in after him and stows it away. Like, if you want to stop me, you're going to have to shoot me. I don't know if ministers actually did this. It's a great image, though. And then he starts the sermon. And that's what I didn't see coming. I mean, its length. And the fact that Melville gives you every word of it. It's chapter 9. It's called the sermon. I'm guessing quite a few of you grew up going to church. When you were a kid, how'd you get through sermons? I mean, I want to know. My strategy was to play hangman with my dad, or draw funny pictures and make my sister laugh. When a sermon shows up in the book you are reading, you either plow through it or you put the book back on the shelf. I decided to read Moby some other time. A few weeks ago, I was talking to my father-in-law about this. My father-in-law is 88 years old, and he said, "I remember that sermon." He said, "That's where I quit too." So I put Moby away and didn't think about it for a few years. And in the meantime, the story kept surfacing. It kept bobbing up in the culture. The old Gregory Peck adaptation was re-released on DVD, and I saw it and liked it. And then there was a Patrick Stewart version that came out, and I saw that, and I thought that was pretty good. And somebody referred to Moby Dick as the American Bible, and I thought, cool, someday. And in the meantime, I just filled up on other stuff. Best thing for me about finishing college was I had time to read for pleasure again. Good fast reads, Elmore Leonard, Ann Tyler, Larry McMurtry, beautiful conversational stories, books that go down like Lucky Charms. You finish one, you go to the bookshelf, you get another one. Every time I went to the bookshelf, my eyes were drawn to Moby Dick. By then, I was thinking of it as the Moby Dick. It had acquired the honorary article, as in the judge, the king, the knowledge of good and evil. This is always a mistake. Never elevate a book beyond the possibility of enjoyment. And then just last fall, I suddenly stopped sleeping. I didn't stop completely. I would fall asleep between 11 and 12, but then at 3, I'd just pop awake, and then I'm awake, thinking about difficulties I have no power to fix. I never imagined that I would be the sort of person that would be awake nights for any reason. I always slept great, so it was pretty annoying, and I developed a strategy, a plan. I downloaded Moby Dick onto my little Kindle e-reader, which is gently backlit and would not disturb my sleeping wife. And when I woke at 3, I just reached for it. And I thought, if anything can put me to sleep, this is going to be it. But you can sort of see what's going to happen, I suspect. You see what's coming. I don't know if my expectations were different at 3 in the morning, or if I just got old enough, or patient enough, or if I had been humbled enough by my diverse failures. But that first night reading, I kept having to stifle laughter. I was afraid I'd wake Robin. I had to get up and walk around the house in the dark and settle myself down. Because it was funny. Herman Melville was funny. He was as funny as Dickens. He was sometimes funnier than Dickens. It wasn't dull, it wasn't academic, it wasn't important, it was entertainment. Next night, same thing. I'm still surprised by this. Moby lays a trap for you in the early chapters by being side-splittingly funny. There's a landlady in Nantucket who serves nothing but chowder, 2 kinds, clam or cod. This landlady comes to your table and says, clam or cod. It's like a Monty Python sketch. Clam or cod? Plus Melville gives you the recipe. On the 3rd night, I arrived at the sermon, chapter 9, and I expected this to be the speed bump, and it just wasn't. Sometimes you fall into a book like falling out of a rowboat. You're just in it. You don't think about it. You just thrash around until you get your bearings. The sermon was actually kind of great. It was about Jonah and the whale, big surprise. Like everything before it in the book, the sermon is full of humor. It's pretty funny. But it's got this deep shade at the center of it, this dark cloud right in the middle. It's the first hint that big things are coming. And after that night, I noticed something new happening. I was looking forward to waking up at 3. A happy insomniac. It took about a month of nights to finish the book. And I've never enjoyed a novel more. I also can't remember enjoying reading itself anymore. And absolutely, the book is a monster of literature. It's one of the majors. It deserves its reputation for better and for worse. Seriously guilty as charged. Its pacing is awkward and overly deliberate. Melville just takes every off-ramp available until the plot just slows down to nothing. And yet I can't stop thinking about it. Since I finished, I have dreamed about whales twice a week. And it's like Uncle Moby showed up at last. He showed up when least expected, and he did a bunch of backflips and sawed a lady in half, and then he pulled an elephant out of the air. And as a bonus, you do come out of it understanding more about sorrow and pain and obsession and stoicism and courage and friendship and whale science than you ever imagined back in the early pages when you were laughing about the clam chowder. So this is what Moby Dick made clear to me. Something I already knew, something you probably already know, and that is that entertainment is not just a full partner in Mortimer Adler's Holy Trinity of reading. Entertainment's the dominant partner. Information and understanding, very helpful. Hail fellows, well met. We need those 2 legs of the stool just to get to entertainment. But if you stop after just those 2, it's like learning the notes and learning the scales and never playing a song. Mortimer was correct about a lot of things. It's important to build a foundation and to read the great books and to be open to more and more books being great books, to expand the pantheon. He was correct to say there are no rules for pleasure reading. But if I could say one thing about it, I would repeat the only advice I ever remember getting on the subject. And this came from one of my English profs, the little white-haired lady that rode her bicycle in the middle of wintertime through the snowdrifts to class. That class was early British lit. And we were about to read something really old and for us really challenging, something written in stanzas, something written at a time when the news was still delivered by itinerant poets. And she said, "Remember that you are not reading, you are traveling. When you open a book, go in as a stranger in a strange land." And what, she said, does a smart traveler do? You brush yourself off and look around. You keep an eye on the weather. When you meet someone, don't talk. Shut up and listen. Because you don't know the customs here. You barely speak the language, no money in your pockets. Plus, these people didn't invite you. They don't care if you approve. And here's the best part. The greatest reason to travel. All the stuff you think defines you, your convictions, your passions, your politics, none of it matters here. All you got to do is keep your eyes open, your head down, and your hopes up. She said, this is a promise. If you travel into their world and stay even a little while, your own world will be larger when you come back. Thanks so much for having me, and I will open it up for discussion and questions if anyone has any. Thank you. Or we could just go home.
So I hope you'll write this as an answer to Mortimer Adler, the whole talk. That was wonderful. And I love Moby Dick, mea culpa, but I love this talk more. I want to talk about your book, which I'm sad you didn't talk about because it's one of the beautiful books and entertaining books, compulsive reading, can't wait to finish it. And when you get to the end, you realize you should have known where it was going because it began the same way that you ended. It's this beautiful mirror situation. But mostly I loved it for the characters. And of course, miraculous Jeremiah, how did you ever, where does he come from? Where does the kind of calm, amazing Roxana come from? And where does Swede come from? Do you have anybody, do you have a sister like that? All of these fabulous characters. So if you could say a little bit about where you get your inspiration for your highly entertaining, beautiful work.
Thank you. I'll take the easy one first. Where does Swede come from? Because Swede was, in a way, an accident and showed up in the car on the way to North Dakota. I had not planned to put a sister in the story, but when Reuben opened the door, she was sitting in the car, and I thought, a sister? I was really glad to have her, glad to see her, and a lot of her strength and her sort of mordancy and her quick wit are certainly borrowed from my own sister, who is older than me, and who is one of the funnier people I know, and who loves a good story, just like Swede. So that one was pretty easy. Jeremiah is, I think there are a lot of dads who would do anything to be able to do a miracle for an ailing child. I thought of Jeremiah just because at the time we had a son who was quite ill. And what happens then? When you're a father and you've got a sick child, what you want to do is a miracle. That's what you want. Of course, I couldn't do one. And I did think about a father, writing a fictional father, who could do miracles, but then it seemed to me the tension was better if he couldn't do the one he most wanted to do. So that's where Jeremiah sort of came from. It was wish fulfillment for me, kind of. I don't know. Reuben, well, look, a lot of people have said, why didn't you have Swede write the book? Why didn't you have Swede tell the story? I perhaps should have done that. A couple of students asked me that today. Would have been a great idea. I didn't think of it. I probably was not smart enough person to write it from Swede's point of view. But thank you for the question.
You said your sister was funny. Do you believe or do you think a person can learn how to be funny, or are they born funny? Is it an acquired or a learned or innate? What is it?
Oh, that's a great question. Is humor acquired, or is it something that you were born with? Most of the funny people I know have just kind of always been funny. I'd love to think that you could take a class and be a funny guy. But I think if that were true, that those classes would be everywhere and they would be full of people. Everybody wants to be a witty person. That's not something I've ever had, but I know a lot of people who do, and I think you've got it or you don't, I'm afraid. There are many things you can learn. I don't know about that. Yeah, here's one. How I got into radio and then writing. I always wanted to be a writer. Well, not always. Since I was about 16, I really wanted to write books. I wanted to write stories, fictional stories, maybe some nonfiction too. But I was enough of a realist to understand I would have to make a living. And so I thought, how could I employ language and make a living at the same time? So journalism seemed like a good answer for that. So I went to a good program at Morehead State and really learned a lot from my profs there and ended up working for Minnesota Public Radio for a number of years. What was really helpful is there was an NPR station in Morehead, KCCM, and I got an internship there my senior year of college and learned a bit about what they wanted. Which didn't prepare me at all for my brief experience in commercial radio, but I wasn't there very long. So then when NPR had an opening, I managed to get a job there. And then that led rather naturally to fiction writing, because when you meet a lot of interesting people in your line of work, it's easy to take bits and pieces and ideas that they give you and the idioms in which they speak and drop them into books. Fiction is not that hard to write when you are around fascinating individuals all the time, and that was my job, was finding really fascinating people and driving out to where they lived and talking to them. You can't get better training than that for fiction writing. I did learn that you have to not just take people whole and put them into books, because there are certain legal liabilities. So I didn't do that. You have to watch the urge to cross-pollinate in those two careers, because once I had started to write a lot of fiction, and I was still working for NPR, I was tempted. Every story I did, I knew I could improve with just the judicious addition of a little fiction, just one source, one eccentric voice. Oh, it was so tempting. To this day, I think I would be tempted. But I never did it. I never invented anything for any of my radio stories. I wanted to literally every time I went out with a microphone. I always knew I could make it better. And then, about the time I left, it was about late 2000, maybe early 2001, there was a guy, a small town radio reporter somewhere in the northern third of the state, I want to say. And I had noticed, I had seen his stuff on the wire services, and every time he had a story, it was something just wonderful. And there was usually a nugget in there that seemed too good to be true. I remember one time he wrote a story, I don't remember the guy's name or where he was, but he wrote a story after a 4th of July holiday about how there had been some kids playing with fireworks, and one of the kids had called the police because he blew his finger off. And the last line in the story was, "The finger was never found." And I read that story on the air, you know. Well, it turned, and all of his stories were like that. It's like, how does this guy find all the best stories? Why is it that all of his have this level of pulp that mine don't have? I wanted some of that. He just seemed like the luckiest guy in the world, and it turned out he was making them all up. Which, you know, you just can't do. But I have to admit that I had a sneaking admiration for the guy because, I mean, I don't know what he's doing now, but he even made a statement, sort of went out grandly and said, "Now I'm free to pursue my real passion." And I thought, this guy is probably going to write a knockout book. I don't know whatever happened to him. The finger was never, I'm still sort of impressed. That life itself would make kind of a good novel, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yes?
So you totally sold me on Moby Dick. I want to know what else is on your required reading list.
Oh, wow. My required list, I don't know if I can give you a required list. I will tell you that my new middle of the night book is Don Quixote, which I have tried before and got bored with, but there again, 3 in the morning does something. It's really funny. It's really funny. So I think I'm going to finish Don Quixote. I'm not sure what I'll go on to next. I would say on a very short list, a person should read as much Robert Louis Stevenson as you can fit in. I know that Huckleberry Finn is the acknowledged classic. I prefer Tom Sawyer. I think it's funnier. I think if you're reading Twain, you might as well just go for funny. Nobody was funnier. Tom Sawyer's a very funny book. Let's see. We should probably talk later about that. Otherwise, I will waste time with my hands in my pockets. Yeah.
Over here
Yes.
in the corner. Other than your tastes, how would you compare your reading to your children's reading? And do you see in them or in any other place in society signs that perhaps we might see any hope of some kind of resurgence of a common reading program or anything like you described earlier?
That's a really good question. I'd be really surprised if we ever had sort of a common core reading program that people just did. That would really surprise me. But I don't feel pessimistic about reading at all. I think that starting maybe with the Harry Potter books when my kids were small, talk about passion in readers. Go to a bookstore at midnight when the new Potter book is being released, and here's a 500-page tome, and these kids are like, "Yay!" It's like, well, I can't be a pessimist. I can't possibly. I never saw anything like that when I was growing up. So I think great books was a fantastic thing, and it served its purpose, and it was probably a very wonderful program. But I don't think, there's a lot of stuff to do now, and it is, to me, kind of like centrifugal force, and everything is moving so fast, and yet I see kids reading a lot. And it's not that they're just reading dreck. A lot of them are reading really good stuff. It doesn't really discourage me. Reading is different now, but I don't think it's worse. And I think in some ways it's even better, because I think young readers, they have to be extra passionate about it if they're going to do it now, because there are so many other choices. You know, and actually, not even all the choices are bad ones. I mean, it would be really fun to be a curmudgeon and say, reading is the only thing that's worth your time. Go ahead, that's fine. But the truth is, there are a lot of good choices. I don't think kids are saying, well, let's see, I could read Moby Dick tonight, or I could go do something really reprehensible. I don't think that's generally the choice. There are a lot of good things to do, and a lot of good programs, and wow, even some sort of startlingly good television, good, well-written TV shows. I don't think everything is going to hell, I guess. Even though it would be sort of fun to play the curmudgeon, I can't really do it. One thing that the evolution of culture has prompted, though, is something that might be new. I'm not sure. Tell me if this is new. I think we're seeing the emergence of the 22-year-old curmudgeon. You know, kids who are 21 or 22 and like, things were better then. I've run into this for the first time in my life, and I think it's hilarious. I can't imagine this ever existed before. Maybe it did. It's new to me. Yes?
How do you think the best way to inspire younger readers to read? Like, I'm going into education where
Yeah.
young kids, they can watch TV or have iPhones at age 5. What do you
Yeah.
think the best way to inspire them to sit down and read is?
I think if they have the basic tools, if they know how to read, the best thing you can do is just find stories that are irresistible, that just sweep them up. You become a reader the first time a book just grabs you. I remember when it was for me. I was 8 years old. I'd been read to my whole life. I was a fairly good reader by the time I was 8, but I wasn't crazy about doing it. I didn't look for reasons to do it. But my third grade teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was reading to us. She'd read to us every day after lunch, you know, so that we could settle down and go back to math. And about 15 minutes is what it took. And she had just finished a book, and I don't remember what that was, but I got a glimpse of the next book that was sitting on her desk, the next read aloud. It was called The Wind in the Willows, and I thought, that sounds a little whispery. I imagined that it might be full of dancing or something. And then she picked it up, and she read chapter 1. And in chapter 1, you probably know the book. I mean, Mole wakes up and it's springtime, and the mole pops out of the ground, and he looks around, and he decides to go for a walk, and he bumps into a water rat. He meets the rat, and the rat says, "Have you ever been in a boat, my friend?" And they get in the rowboat, and they go have a picnic, and Mole falls in the water because he tries to row, and he misses the water with the oars and loses his balance. And then they go back to Ratty's place, and Ratty makes him some food and gives him some warm clothes and builds a fire, and they sit around, and he falls asleep filled with great joy and contentment. Okay, so as plots go, there's not a whole lot there. You know, I considered myself a man of action when I was 8. And yet, what happened that day is I went home, and I said to my mom, Mrs. Johnson started a book called The Wind in the Willows today, and I think it's going to be pretty good. And Mom said, well, we have that book. And she went to the shelf and got it down and gave it to me, and I cracked the book, and I read the rest of the evening, and then I went to bed, and I turned on a flashlight under the covers and finished it, because I couldn't stop. It was just, I had to see what happened. And of course, the book turns out to be this fantastic piece of storytelling. And I think that's what you have to have is, and who knows what book it is that speaks to those kids. But if you can find the books that do, they'll be readers forever, forever, because nothing gives the same sort of pleasure that just a joyful piece of reading does. The materials, yeah. I think we have probably used up our time. We good? Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming, and we're gonna have a little reception out here, and Leif Enger will sign some books, and we can have some nice chats. All right, thanks again.